All right, we have participants joining, and so we'll go ahead and get started in about 3 minutes, just to let people in the door, and then we'll get started right away at 3. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started right at 3, so I'll just give you about 1 more minute to get situated, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, it is 3 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled that we all get to hear, including myself, even though I've heard from them before, but excited to hear from them again. Brent Conway and Jen Hogan, and they are going to be sharing sort of their route and their journey through implementation of the science of reading, working through the different barriers that many of you have encountered as well. And because they're sort of in the field right now, doing this right now, I love that you get to hear from them, because I don't get to have those same experiences, and so they get to share sort of the boots on the ground experience and are in similar roles to all of you. And so I am going to hand it over to Brent and Jen and have them introduce themselves and get started.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I'm Brent Conway. I am an assistant superintendent for the Pentucket Regional School District, which is in Massachusetts. We're just north of Boston. And prior to the work in Pentucket, I was a middle school and then elementary school principal for almost 15 years outside of Boston as well. And a classroom teacher prior to that, and a few host of other things too. So.
My name is Jen Hogan. I am the ELA and Humanities Curriculum Coordinator at the elementary level in the Pentucket Regional School District, which is K-6 in our district. So I do work with students from kindergarten all the way through 6th grade. Before I joined the team in Pentucket, I spent about 10 years as a reading specialist in an urban setting. So kind of seen both here. Pentucket is a much smaller district and has a different demographic than where I was before, but we are so excited to be here. It's already dark and cold here and a couple hours later than you all, so thanks for sticking with us after school, and we're excited to walk you through our journey.
All right, so we're gonna just start off with sharing the screen, and we'll walk through some of this, and that's probably the best way for us to get started. So.
And as we get started, I'm just going to point out we do have the Q&A open and going. So Sarah and the other folks from the department will be monitoring that for us, and we will have plenty of time at the end to try to answer some of your questions. So feel free, if you have any, to jot them down or just pop them in the Q&A box, and then we'll spend some time at the end in more of a discussion.
Sure. And this presentation is similar to one Sarah and her team were able to see that was presented at the National Reading League conference in Syracuse, New York this fall, and that's what connected us. And we talk a lot about, you don't see the science of reading anywhere in the heading, and some of that's a little bit on purpose, and that this is really a discussion around the leadership side of it. Some of the things you can expect to do as leaders, the things you can expect to see, and that there are layers to this that go well beyond just some simple shifts or a professional development or even just adopting a curriculum. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then our own experiences with it as well, and share some of the data with you and share some of the pitfalls, the things to look out for. So we actually, some of the struggles that we've experienced, despite 4, 5, 6 years of work around this, we've sort of have termed as the balanced literacy hangover, and that it's the fact that balanced literacy was the predominant instructional approach that teachers were learning, that they were engaged with for 15, 20, 25, 30 years of work, going back to the late 80s and into the 90s, that shifting out of that and into a brand new curriculum or a whole new way of thinking about things is not going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen in a year. In fact, it might take multiple years. And it's those sort of practices and routines and even understandings that go beyond just teaching phonics that are going to linger, and you're going to see them keep on coming up even when you think you have moved everything beyond that. And that's the part that we are experiencing, and we want to sort of help other districts begin to see and understand that across the country about what they can expect as they move beyond this.
We have a few objectives for you here today. So these are the things that we're really hoping that you can start to think about, maybe as we're talking, things that we'll follow up on in the Q&A. But what we want you to be able to take away from today, based on what we've learned, first is thinking about, with respect to where you're at in the process, be able to identify some next steps for you as a school or as a district, or in whatever capacity you are leading a shift in curriculum, particularly literacy, when you're thinking about implementing a new high quality literacy program. And I know that many of you are today, and you may be at different points in the process, and we'll kind of talk you through what our process has been. So hopefully, no matter where you are in it, it'll get your wheels turning about what's going to come next for you. We're also, like Brent said, going to frame this less around the science of reading per se, but more around the systems that need to be in place. Oh my goodness, I so apologize. I have a few guests. Attendees will be able to describe how.
So you can see the objectives there. I'll get it for her. This is what happens when we have Zoom, right? These are the objectives that we hope for you to do, that you'll understand what you can expect from a school system and structures around implementation of new curriculum, but pedagogy as well. But then also, what are those challenges and barriers that we can essentially prepare you for, that you can anticipate. So. Especially when we start talking about high quality core curriculum materials, because if you're going to change your curriculum adoption and you're going to adopt materials that are more aligned with what the science and evidence says, you can't use your old practices with them. They're not designed to be used that way. So,
again, I so apologize for that interruption. Okay, so it's a little bit later over here, so my apologies.
So one of the resources we found that you might find helpful, it comes from Meredith Lieben and Sue Pimentel. It's called Placing Text at the Center. And both of them were sort of the key authors of the Common Core standards, which serve as sort of the foundation for what most states have adopted. And even if they say they didn't, it's still based on it, some revision in the last 5 or 6, 7 years. And this quote really sort of captured what we experienced. And I remember in some of our early work with this, so if you want to know where we are as a school district, I started in district 5 years ago, and we started with sort of professional development and really helping everyone to understand what did the science say about what to teach, and helping teachers to think about planning differently. It took about 2 to 3 years of that, and we started to develop a plan to move forward. There was a recognition that we needed a new curriculum. That was part of it. People were fully engaged in a lot of professional development after some initial pushback, for sure. And we were moving along. And we go to implement a new curriculum. And at first, everyone, for several years, people had been doing foundations and had been doing it well. We added Heggerty, and people started to understand the necessity and how to teach decoding. We had a tiered system, we had a schedule in place, and we had supports. And then we implemented Wit and Wisdom last year as the core curriculum for all the language components. So with all that and all that professional development, Jen joined us last year, helping to coach and doing all these things. We started to realize some people still were having trouble letting go of some of the things they used to do. And this quote from this guide, and there's actually two pieces there from Achieve the Core. There's an article to read, which is fantastic. And then they actually have a table that breaks it down about different steps you can take. But even teachers using excellent newly aligned programs are sometimes reverting to a strategies, skills first use of those materials. And that strategy, skills first use, that is sort of a relic of that balanced literacy curriculum. And they're struggling to implement these new lessons and new curricula as designed because it requires them to unlearn what they had learned over the years. And we saw that quote, we just said, that is what we are experiencing. And then we just have example after example that we're going to share with you. So this is us. We talked about it. I am the assistant superintendent, who was formerly a principal. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Southern Mississippi. And in Massachusetts, we've been doing these trainings. Jen and I do them separately. We do them together. It's actually how sort of we met. We came together doing some of this literacy work across the state of Massachusetts. And now we do it, with different states and different people around the country as well. And it's not always just a focus on dyslexia. A lot of our focus is actually on the general ed, the bigger picture of it all, of how all of that supports the dyslexia, students with dyslexia as well. So, Jen?
Yeah, so as Brent said, we both have been doing this for a number of years now. Like I said in the beginning, my background was really in urban education before I joined the team at Pentucket, where we also implemented a new curriculum over there. So, we've seen the pendulum swinging, if you will. It's what a lot of people like to call it, and seen the tides turning. But really, we're really working. We believe in this so much that we're really working across the state and across the country now because we want it to be successful, right? We want it to be successful for the teachers that we work with in our district, but ultimately we know that there are so many of you making this shift that we want to be able to share where we're at so that it can be successful. And really it's about the kids in the end, right? We really just want all kids to be able to learn the best that they can. And the work that we do is really around supporting that, is really around supporting those students. So we won't redo our resume, if you will, but there it is for you to see. So everything we do, we said we weren't going to focus necessarily on the science of reading, but everything that we do is really grounded in research and really is grounded in that science. And so what you're looking at here is a visual that many of you may be familiar with, but this is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. And what you see is that there are two parts of the rope. We have the language comprehension side and the word recognition side. And like many high quality core curricular materials, not all of them will include both strands of this rope, but many do. And some do one part well, and they may not do the other part very well. But what this is showing you is that there are so many pieces to becoming a proficient reader and to becoming a skilled reader that have to be executed and learned and intertwined perfectly. And you can see the strands of the rope there that are really weaving together. And with increasing automaticity, that's how skilled reading is developed. And without either part, we're going to see students who are really struggling with literacy. And I think when we're thinking about Scarborough's rope, what we're thinking about is the PD that Brent mentioned that has been done with the teachers for years before this curriculum was really even in place yet. And the professional development and the knowledge that the teachers were gaining around research-based reading practices and what you might call the science of reading was really grounded in this rope, so that when it came time to adopt a new literacy curriculum, they were thinking, okay, we see where this is coming from. We may not like it right now, and that's okay, but we do kind of see where this is coming from because we're starting to develop an understanding of what are the pieces of skilled reading and why are they so important to be able to work them all together. And like we said, it's not really a phonics patch. It's not necessarily all phonics. That's only a very small piece of this rope and a piece of that puzzle. And we really need both sides to be able to have students be skilled proficient readers. And so we can head to the next slide here, but this really ties into what is the simple view of reading, right? So if we take the rope and we turn it just a little bit, right, we had that word recognition part, which is that decoding box, that light blue, times language comprehension, and that's what ultimately equals reading comprehension. This multiplication problem here, if one of those pieces is suffering, if students are struggling with one of those parts, we can't make up for it in another way. So if I'm not able to decode, I can't make up for that by being an excellent language comprehender. I can't make up for that by having the text read aloud to me necessarily. So with both of those pieces functioning well, we have students that are able to understand the text that they're reading, and all of those pieces have to be fitting together. So with that being said, what we have in Pentucket is a full assessment system to be able to assess students on all of the pieces that go into the reading rope and that go into the simple view of reading. And what we say frequently is we assess to the point of breakdown. And so we will open up our document so that you can see it, but here is just the overview of what that looks like from pre-K all the way through 8th grade in terms of what are the skills that we're assessing students on, just as a baseline. And then you'll see how we're able to break that down even a little bit more and figure out where exactly are kids struggling and what instruction do they need to close that gap to be able to allow them to move forward. And we will share this with you. So, but Brent, if you want to open it up.
I will. And I'll just add, I think, one of those lingering things that we see about balanced literacy is the idea of reading comprehension is something that they're always very concerned with. And of course, we're concerned with it as well. That is the outcome we want. But reading comprehension is just that. It's an outcome. It of itself is not really a skill. And you see that in Scarborough's Rope, that there are so many things that contribute to the outcome of comprehending what one reads. And in order, if a student is struggling as a reader, we have to know where that point of breakdown is. And we use the phrase, if your only tool in your tool bag is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So if all you're ever doing is assessing for comprehension, then of course, everything looks like a comprehension issue if the kid doesn't do well. But the reality is, rarely is that the case. It's usually something underlying. So you have to have a system that allows you to assess to the point of breakdown, and then intervene and instruct from there. So let's see if we can open this up a little bit here. Here we are, and we can scroll through it. So you can see the same image that's there. And this is something that we had developed, we started to develop, I think, prior to Jen joining us. And then when Jen joined us, really began to help lay it out a little bit further. We have data meetings where all of this becomes really useful 3 times a year, where we are looking at kids. And you can see as we scroll down, the colors in these bars up here are relevant to the colors in this chart. So we look at this and we have 3 columns here. So for letter naming fluency, that's our assessment. It's that color. It matches the bar up above. We have a screener that we do 3 times a year in kindergarten and grade 1. And then on the far column over here, we have diagnostics. So if we know a student needs a special education evaluation and they're really struggling, we have some other tools that we can use to assess that issue. But we also have something in the middle where if a student is struggling and we're not quite sure why, we have some other tools we can do. And that's how this whole chart and information is broken down, and it's color-coded. And as you keep going, you can see all those different colors of the types of things that we would assess for. And all of these as screeners are valid and reliable assessments. They are not assessments that are observation-based that can't be replicated necessarily. So you won't see things like leveled assessments on this chart because that is not supported by research as a tool to be able to determine what might be a source of breakdown. In fact, they can be really unreliable assessment tools. We have a whole nother story about that, about how unreliable it can be. And it's actually one of the things you can do as an administrator is to examine how well your assessments correlate with your actual outcomes of kids. And that is a helpful data tool for administrators to use when they're trying to evaluate, number one, their own system, but evaluate and help other people to understand why things may or may not be effective tools. Jen, do you want to talk a little bit further about some of these tools here?
Yeah, so what you're looking at in terms of the reading assessment for these pages are, when we're talking about assessing to the point of breakdown, there are times, and it really depends on what assessment you're using, because while there are assessments that aren't as reliable as others, there are still multiple ways to do this, right? There are still multiple assessments that we can use that are valid and reliable and backed by research, but they don't tell us everything. And so I'm thinking of, for example, in the upper grades, really the screener assessments that we have don't give us very much insight into a student's decoding skills. So we may assess a 4th or 5th grade student and it looks like they're not a fluent reader, and everyone thinks, well, then that student just needs to work on fluency. But what we have to do is really work backwards from that. So a student's not comprehending, let's figure out why. Let's see how they're doing with fluency. We know those are very highly correlated. So we start to work backwards till we find that point of breakdown. If their fluency is struggling, then we go down even further and we assess their word recognition skills. And then as you move forward, you can see we've broken it down all the way by the different subtests that we're screening for and we're assessing. And then there are some very explicit instructional practices and instructional suggestions for analyzing the data and looking at what might be the student's target for instruction, what might be their instructional focus when we are working with them in a small group, or the classroom teacher is working with them, or we're putting them with an interventionist. So you can see even something like letter sound fluency, which may not seem, altogether very complex. When we really start to look at the data, we can see that that might break down into 2 separate issues there. It's an accuracy issue, they don't know all their letter sounds yet, or it's an automaticity and it's a recall issue. And you're going to do different things based on what that data is telling you. And so we've laid all of this out for the teachers to be able to start developing the capacity for understanding the data as we collect it. And we do have data meetings 3 times a year. And, we've been doing so for a number of years now, but we're really still living in this space of developing the teacher capacity to look at the data and then make some instructional decisions accordingly. And I think that's part of the lingering practices that we're seeing too, is taking the data at face value. And so like Brent said, it seems like everybody has a comprehension issue when you're in the upper grades, and that's all you're really assessing. But when you start to look further, well, that student can't read a good portion of the words, and that's really the issue here. It's not necessarily a comprehension issue. And so this structure is setting the teachers up to be able to have some really clear guidelines and some really clear steps for analyzing the data they're collecting and then using it accordingly. And so this document has been really powerful for us as we walk teachers through data protocols, and we have our data meetings 3 times a year. And then, as they're making instructional decisions on the fly with their grade level teams or their intervention teams, or, as they're working with students and we're trying to move them along. So we'll make sure that, you can take a closer look at this.
So in this, I think this is sort of what we get at. So in order to have everyone understand this, and this is a suggestion we make, I think, for most districts, is as you step into this work, saying that you're just going to do professional development is a part of it, or saying we're just going to buy a curriculum is a part of it. Our suggestion is always develop a comprehensive literacy plan that's multiple years. You can see, we started this work in 2017 and 2018. This is a plan written from 2021 to 2026, a multi-year plan with goals that are clearly articulated. There's actually a link later on here. If you want to see our plan on our website, you can do that. Because this is a systems issue. It's not a curriculum or teacher training issue alone. Those are part of the systems, right? And like any system issue, there's some underlying things. And so there's two phrases here. So it provides, the why and the how. And if anyone's familiar with Simon Sinek, he really talks about, as districts or as people, we tend to be really good about the what. We can be really good about telling people the what. And that's that outer circle that he talks about. And as schools, I know we're very good about saying the what. We're going to do letters training. We're going to adopt wit and wisdom. Like, that's what we're going to do. It's the what. The why and the how we're not always so good about. And the why is really in the center. And that's where data feeds that. And you really get people to understand, why are we doing this? So when the time comes to move, as Jen said, some people still may not like it, but they have a hard time arguing against it because the why is pretty well established, right? Sometimes the why is personal too. And it gets people to really be in that place. And the how allows people to see, where is it going, the steps, so that they can start to connect things. And two great quotes from Deming: every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And if you continue to have 40% of your students who aren't proficient, that's the system feeding that, right? And then this last one, he says, a bad system will beat a good person every time. And when we really talk about this, if you take a teacher and you send them off and they call it letters training or whatever the training is that they do, and they're so excited, they come back to their classroom, but the expectation in the system is still you do a leveled assessment, you're going to find that the system is going to beat that well-intentioned, now well-informed teacher each time. So you have to connect all these systems for people. So we actually did a lot of the system work before we did some of the real implementation work, so that when they went to go implement, the systems were there to support them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed here. So, what really is that balanced literacy hangover that we're sort of talking about? And really, it's just these lingering practices and routines. And I swear I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but it's these lingering practices, routines, but also the way you think about kids and teaching reading and so forth. Much like we talked about, if you see everything, it's a comprehension. We want kids to love reading and comprehend. If that's your way of thinking, that's going to linger for a while until you understand it a little bit differently. And these are the things we see. It's almost like cognitive dissonance at times. Despite being trained, despite understanding it, some people have a really hard time connecting it, and they still go back and use some of the things that they are very not consistent with everything they just learned. Sometimes a lot of wasted time, right? Like they're using things that just aren't transferable. It was something they always used, they liked it. And it's not necessarily out of spite or pushback. It's just they're not necessarily always connecting everything. Teaching reading is maybe the most complex thing that our teachers do, more so than other subjects. And I think that's the part that is challenging. And I think we have to anticipate what some of those are and help people to understand. And also understand, give them grace with it and help them to work through it. Because a lot of times it's not on purpose. It's just helping them to connect those things. But it really does threaten the success of curriculum implementation. If we are going to make this shift to the science of reading, it really is more than just some shifts. There is more to it.
Something to think about too as leaders is you don't have to be a reading specialist or know all of this about literacy in order to do this work, right? Like Brent's background is not a reading specialist. Mine just happens to be, but really your job as leaders is setting up these systems and anticipating some of those practices that you might see, right? And knowing enough about it that you can go in and start to see some of these patterns. But this took us a while to even put our finger on what was happening. We started to see and we heard feedback from teachers, but you don't need to be able to teach a first grader how to read in order to do all of this really quite well. So just keeping that in the back of your head, you have people around you, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I know it seems like a lot with the balanced literacy and the science of reading, and really it's more of the systems behind it and setting teachers up to be successful when they get into the classroom that's in your school or in your district.
And this part here, so when Common Core standards came out, they they identified three really big shifts that needed to happen. And so when we start to hear, you hear districts, oh, we are moving towards science of reading, or we shifted towards science of reading, or no, we're teaching a good phonics program now, so we're doing the science of reading, is a phrase you hear. That's the phonics patch. So if you keep everything else the same of how you are teaching comprehension, and all you do is you add, and writing as well, if you keep it the same and all you do is add a phonics program, that's actually balanced literacy. You have the phonics over here, and then you have everything else over here. And sometimes what you're doing is you're actually undermining the really good instruction with phonics with some of the ways, those lingering practices that are not consistent, because there's a lot of science and evidence around the way we should teach kids to comprehend as well. And much of what is available through balanced literacy or workshop programs is not consistent with that either. I like to say, if you think you were sold a story about the phonics, wait till you learn that comprehension hasn't been being taught correctly either. And I think we see this too, and this is like almost like this misconception to some extent that, the Big Five was from the National Reading Panel, and we're going back to 2000 at this point, right? And there's a lot of curriculums out there that can check the 5 boxes that they have all 5 in there. The Common Core standards were meant to give more context essentially to the comprehension side of that, and that there is more to the way you teach comprehension. It's not a skills and strategies approach first. It's around the 3 big pieces that are identified there, that students need to engage with grade level complex every day with the appropriate scaffolds and instruction. They need to build conceptual knowledge. So not just a single random article or a story about something, and that a volume of conceptually related text is really critical. Paired selections, multiple texts that have different perspectives around a concept. Those are the types of things that allow students to build knowledge. And then students have to write in response to those complex texts. And those are 3 really big things. They should not necessarily be writing about choices for lunch, for instance. They don't necessarily write about what am I doing over my Christmas vacation. Those are good personal narratives. And why do we choose those? Because you can't write about something you don't know anything about. And it's really important that we give them the knowledge and teach them how to write from those texts and in response to those texts, and move away from those more traditional narrative approaches to writer's workshop. And by doing this, we are going to move past those practices of balanced literacy into more evidence-based work and really move kids along. And there's some good links in here too around some of those steps, but you can essentially search the 3 big shifts on Common Core, and there's some great resources out there about them. So.
This we're going to start to get into now, some of the specifics, right? So what are some of those systems that we can have in place? What can we do to try to be successful? And what are some of the things to really look out for? And then at the end, we'll talk about really what is the outcome then for students, right? Again, so an important thing to remember is that all of this is really ongoing work. I don't think it's ever going to end with, okay, we bought a new curriculum, we put it in place, we've done some PD around it, and that's that, and we're going to fly. And I think that's true with any curriculum implementation, but especially these high quality literacy curriculums that are a big shift from what teachers were used to doing in the past. And so we are really engaged with this cycle here of ongoing, what is the need, planning with stakeholders, giving some really valuable and responsive professional development to the teachers based on where we see that need is. I swear Brent and I talk every week, if not every day, like, what have you seen as we're in classrooms? And I need to get some PD out on this specific thing. And every month it seems like it's changing, but that's that cycle that we see, as teachers become more proficient with the planning piece, other things start to pop up and we start to notice as we're in classrooms, and we're really using that cycle to just continue on to make the implementation even stronger and to support the teachers and the students the best that we can. So we'll go through some of the systems now. And really the important thing to think about, I won't read this whole slide to you, but as we were saying, you can train teachers all you want in anything that you want, but if we're sending them back to a school or a district where the system is not established and does not allow for them to be successful, then they're not going to be successful, right? And we had actually a conversation yesterday with a curriculum, representatives from a curriculum, and they were saying, they were working with a school district, and we were talking about some of those barriers for them, and they said, well, they don't have any professional development time built into their schedule. And that makes it really challenging for us as, representatives to ensure successful implementation, but also for the school district to be able to support the teachers the way that really they need to. And so that's one of the steps on here that we were just talking about, but that ongoing, ever evolving and never ending PD, but also the time, and that might be, even contractually related, with the teachers, but that time to be able to do it very well. At the top here, you see strong tier 1 curriculum and instruction. We can't intervene our way out of a tier 1 problem. And that is a message that our teachers have heard over and over again. As we look at the data and we look at how many students really have a need for literacy intervention or small group, we start to look at our tier 1 curriculum. And that's the work that Brent's been doing for years in our district, is looking at the data and saying, we have a disproportionate number of students who appear like they need intervention. And that's telling us something about the tier 1 core curriculum that's in our classrooms. It is not serving the population and percentage of students that really it should be. We should be looking at something closer to 75 to 80% of the students being successful. And our data was not showing that at all. And so in order to try to flip that triangle back the other way, we need to fix what's going on in tier 1. And that's really what it comes down to. We can provide intervention all we want, but until we fix what's going on in the classroom, then that intervention is just going to be that hamster wheel for the teachers. And that's what we really start to see. So we have schedules built for that tiered instruction, annual growth for all and catch-up growth for those who are behind. That actually comes from a book out of Washington. And Brent, you can probably speak to the logistics of the book better than I can, but they set a goal to have all of their students becoming proficient readers. I think they said over 3 years. Did it take them 7? Am I correct in saying that? 10? Okay, it took them 10 years. But that idea that students that are on grade level, we want them to keep making that grade level progress, but students that are behind, we're going to need a little bit more. And in order to do that little bit more, we need the systems in place. So we're using data, we're setting student goals, we're setting school-wide goals, and that mindset of collective effort of the students that we're sharing ownership. Again, so these are just some of the systems. I'm sure there are more that we have that aren't even on there, but we are all working together. That literacy plan really helps drive some of this work and engages all of the stakeholders so that we're all working towards a common goal with a common message that is going to allow this change to happen and start to allow teachers and students to be successful. So what does the research say about this work? And I kind of spoke to this before, and Brent can give you some more of his perspective on it, that leadership is key. But again, the principals and district leaders and superintendents do not have to be reading specialists to make this happen. And so the reason that you're speaking with both of us today is because there are many case studies out there that show that having 2 key people that are functioning in different ways in the leadership role can make a huge difference. And we joke about this in our district. It's like good cop, bad cop. Brent can say one thing and then I can go in and say the exact same thing. And it just, everyone, well, Jen said we can do this and this is what we'll do, right? So it's just Brent in his role as assistant superintendent has the capacity to make these larger scale systems level changes. And then from my perspective as an instructional coach and a curriculum coordinator, I can provide direct support to teachers. I can be in classrooms much more often. I can work with teachers on planning, on looking at the data, can provide some of that PD. And so both of those roles are really key pieces to allowing this to be successful. And so when you're thinking about yourself and what your role is, thinking about, do you have somebody that can fill the other shoes to be able to either affect more widespread change from a systems perspective or be more boots on the ground and in the classroom and really influencing teachers. And it's also really important that those two people, though, are on the same page and are giving that same message and that are working together in this work. But you don't have to be a reading specialist. You don't have to know everything there is to know about the science of reading, nor even really be letters trained yourself in order to understand some of this. And so everybody has the capacity to be able to do it. And it just helps to have somebody else working alongside you.
Yeah. And we say letters trained, and we don't necessarily, there's tons of other trainings out there. Keys to Literacy is one, AIM Institute, and there's a bunch of others. But I think you get the idea. So we use a phrase here too, the simple view of implementing a tiered literacy system. And this is sort of a concept that I developed over the years, having done this as an elementary principal back in 2007, 2008, and now again as an assistant superintendent, and then helping others in that, it's obviously this is a play off the simple view of reading, but that our outcome is we have this tiered system because not every kid is going to be served by the tier 1 instruction. There are going to be kids who need more, right? And you need a system in place that allows some of those kids to get more if they need it, right? And what feeds that? The data, the personnel, the schedules, all those things. So what makes that tiered system work? Well, obviously, teachers need to be able to teach, and they need to be able to teach in accordance with what research has told us. And we need to give them curriculum tools that allow them to do it, that don't trip them up, that don't waste their time searching through all kinds of stuff, or that don't give them half of the stuff that's good and half of it's not so good, right? You want curriculum tools that are the best aligned. And there are those out there. But that doesn't solve it all. And at the same time, as an administrator, I'm not teaching every day. And most of you as administrators, you're not there in that classroom doing that work every day. That is the teacher's role to implement that. That's the reading specialist role, special education teacher's role. Over here, though, we have systems and structures, schedules, the personnel management, the screening, the data, that dogmatic leadership of scheduling these data meetings and ensuring we have an agenda, ensuring everyone's doing the progress monitoring they need to do. All of those things, those system side, that's the administrator's job. That's where you have the greatest influence to move this and the greatest way to sort of keep people out of falling into those routine traps from balanced literacy. Set the system up that it's not easy to do, right? And schedules are a big part. So we work to try and flood grade levels with personnel at certain times when we know we're going to do small group targeted instruction. So if I have 3 classrooms at a grade level, we have 3 classroom teachers for half an hour or 45 minutes. We'll be able to send in an additional 3 people, special education teacher, a reading specialist, an interventionist, maybe even another one as a paraprofessional. So all of a sudden we have 7 people working with 3 classrooms of kids. So the kids who are furthest behind can get the most targeted and direct instruction that they need in that period of time. We can't do that all day, but I can do it from one grade level to the next to the next. Who knew, right? When art class was, or when PE class was, would drive when we teach literacy and math. Who would knew? But I learned that as a principal pretty quickly. And if you're not used to sort of managing those schedules, that can be something that's hard to take away from folks. They don't want to give up that time, right? And that's going back to if you have a plan that talks about where you're going, where that collective goal is, you can go back to the plan and say, well, this is why we're doing it. Again, back to the why. Really important. We're really good at the what. I can say we're going to change the schedule. I can even give them the how. Here's what it's going to look like. But if I don't explain the why, you're going to get a lot of pushback from that. And that's important to remember.
We're going to talk you through some of the things that you can start to anticipate and start to look for. And these are based on what practices that we've seen in the classrooms over the past couple of years that have really revealed the cracks in our system that we have had to address, whether that be through professional development or fixing a schedule here, or, addressing something via coaching with the teacher. But I'm going to go through these and give you some more specific examples of things that you can start to look for, and be one step ahead of where we were, really learn from some of our mistakes. But these are all facets of that balanced literacy that is still lingering within our classrooms as teachers try to merge what they've learned for so long with these new curricular materials, and find a way to really resolve that cognitive dissonance that's going on in their brain, because it is so hard to do. And most of this that I'll talk about has come about without teachers even realizing. Our teachers have worked so hard and put in endless amounts of time and effort. And most of these things that we're picking up on, they don't realize that they're doing. And so we just need to be able to support them in fully understanding that why, and making the shift further away from trying to, jam the square peg in the round hole of making all of this fit together.
Yeah, well-intended teachers, some of these practices are actually like harmful and undermining. Some of them are just kind of waste of time. That's what they are. And the time could be spent better doing something else with a better result.
Yeah. The first, we've addressed a little bit, but that cueing after teaching phonics. So you get a really high quality research and evidence-based phonics program, you pop it into your K-2 or K-3 classrooms. And after the teachers deliver their 20 or 30-minute lesson, they go to the guided reading table and they pull students, and whether they use a leveled text or not, they are cueing the students with various strategies that are not supported by research to allow students to read the words. And we're starting to see that, that misuse of tools and resources that are available to them that may be research-based, that aren't quite being used the right way. So you can see this even with something like a decodable text, where, there's just different types of prompting going on that is not supported by research. And it's that coaching and feedback that are really important. But what I've found also are those replacement strategies. So teachers want to know, well, if I'm not supposed to do this, then what else can I do? And often it's the lack of the replacement strategy that is driving the teacher to use those practices that they've been using for so long, because they're so just ingrained and it comes naturally to them. And that's just what they've been doing forever. So if we're not giving them something concrete to replace that with, then we're going to keep going back to the old ways. And so what I work with my teachers on are, well, if you're so used to saying, look at the picture to figure out that word, which research has shown that is not an efficient way to become a word reader, and that is not the way that the brain learns how to read words. Well, I need to be able to tell them what to say instead, right? Even if it's something as simple as make sure you're sounding out the word, look at every sound. But we have to coach the teachers through that and give them something to replace that with, so that they don't revert back to these strategies. And that's something that as administrators, we can look for too, right? So we can start to see some of that cueing afterwards and start to look at, as we're doing an observation on a teacher, we're working with the grade level team, we can really see that. And that's that phonics patch that we've been referring to. Putting phonics in does not necessarily mean, and it usually doesn't if it's alone, that the students are going to be following a research-based program.
Yeah. And this is like a perfect example, the story. And maybe some of you have these posters in your classrooms, right? In the schools, Eagle Eye. I mean, you look at it, it's cute, the Beanie Baby, things. And it seems fairly innocent in its appearance. But when Jen was hired in the summer a couple of years ago, she had come for a visit, and we were touring, and the schools were empty at that point. And I was bringing her around, and I said I wanted to get her excited, like, oh, look at all this work we've been doing. So we go into a kindergarten classroom where the teacher had been totally immersed in doing this work, had done intensive professional development, and was doing a really good job in the classroom. Never someone who pushed back about any of it. And here I am, like bragging, like, oh, come see all this great work, get you excited to come work with us. And we walk into the classroom, and there is that stupid poster on her wall. And I was so embarrassed by it. I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God. And I knew Jen saw it. And so we have to take this down. And it was this, and whether or not she was still cueing them on these things, I don't know. I mean, that wasn't, it was more that it was there, and she never realized, despite all that professional development, like that's the opposite of what you should be doing. So sometimes we have to be, you get PD, they're not going to say, don't do this, pull those posters down, they're not going to say those things all the time. As administrators, we have to help them connect those pieces a little bit. And, and she was never told that poster, eagle eye and all that, that's the opposite. You don't want to do that. She needed that replacement to understand what to do and what not to do.
I didn't tell Brent at that point that I'd had these on a bookmark, when I worked with small groups of kids years previously, but yeah, and it's true, it's everywhere. And, I have a reading specialist background, and this is what I learned too. And so it's really learning alongside people, but being able to recognize that when we see it. Another piece that we see, and this is a big shift that reflects those Common Core standards that Brent was speaking about, but the idea of siloed skills. And what we mean by that is particularly in the area of comprehension. And I know in the past, I used a curriculum that, generally was knowledge-based, right? The kids learned about, animal partnerships, and they learned about various different habitats and cultures and things like that. But on one week we taught main idea, and we taught main idea all week, and we used all different texts, and we taught main idea. And then the next week we taught compare contrast, and the interventionist worked on compare contrast, and we worked on compare contrast. And then the next week we made inferences. And then the week after that, we practiced sequencing, and then we repeated it over and over. And that's really not the way that research says is the best way to teach comprehension. And that's not the way that most of these programs are designed. They're designed to really integrate all of those skills together so that when we're comparing and contrasting, we're comparing and contrasting two texts that we read, or within a text, or from 1 week to what we read 3 weeks ago, we're comparing and contrasting. And so it's not all siloed, and we're not just learning it all in that one point and then moving on. And that can be very difficult as a teacher, because I had a teacher ask me, we had a district visiting us, and they said, I'm just struggling with, to what degree do I trust the program? What degree do I trust the program that it's actually going to come back? And so my answer to that teacher was, well, we have to know the program. So we have to be able to look ahead and see that that spiral is going to happen and that it is going to come back. We're not blindly trusting, but also, yeah, we are trusting these programs because people that are a lot smarter than us wrote the programs and have used decades of research and built these really carefully and intentionally. And that's what makes it a cohesive model. And that knowledge building is really important, and everything is going to spiral and tie together. I tell my teachers, we're trying to do away with the randomness. We're trying to do away with, reading about, bears today and, penguins tomorrow, and then books the next day, and just comparing and contrasting in these really siloed areas. But again, teachers need support, and they need some replacement, and they need some coaching and feedback on how to do this. But we started to notice, teachers still really wanted to teach main idea, and they really wanted to pull their small group, and they wanted to practice the sequencing, but that's not really how this is designed. And that's not how we're designed to comprehend, as we move through the grade levels and become adult proficient readers. That's not really what it is. Comprehension is all of those pieces coming together like we saw in that reading row. So teachers need the training and the systems to do that. We spoke already quite a bit about assessing for levels and using drill down assessments, but it's just something to continue to think about. We need to be seeking those valid and reliable, both universal screeners and drill down assessments to be able to target instruction. We have all those in place. You saw our assessment plan, but we're still working on some of that. What does that look like in terms of instruction? Both the what and the why and the how, all three of those pieces really coming together. But we can't send teachers to specialized training and then have them come back and use an assessment that's assessing for levels and attempt to give, really targeted instruction based on that level. It just isn't going to work that way. Piggybacking off of that, and this was something that was new to me right around the time actually that we were giving this at the Reading League conference just a few months ago, but again, revealing the cracks in the system, right? This really has showed there are some systems in place, and there are some beliefs and practices still lingering within the special education department, and teachers that are not evidence-based and that really are starting to undermine what we're doing in Tier 1 instruction. And these are our students that need the most support, that need the most cohesiveness, that need the most targeted instruction. But what we found as I started to meet with teachers were, IEP goals that were written that were not based around the science of reading and that were not allowing the students to tie in that what they were learning in Tier 1 to their Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention. And so I had a teacher ask me for a list of the first 500 fry words because that was what the student's 5th grade reading goal happened to be. And she wanted to take that list and practice those words with them because that's what the goal said, right? And that goal, again, cut the randomness. That goal didn't have anything to do with what they were learning in Tier 1. Are high frequency words important? Absolutely. We definitely want students to be able to be automatic with that. But when the goals are not tied to research and not tied to Tier 1, it starts to undermine the rest of the instruction that we're giving them. And it starts to undermine the quality of our multi-tiered system of support. And that doesn't start to function the right way when we don't have everything lined up and people talking in that way. So that's something that we're still working on, honestly, as a district. That's a very slow process for any of you that work in special education. That it can be a tough needle to move, but we're again developing the capacity of the teachers and trying to get all of that on the same page, as we started to realize what was in some of these IEPs and the way that that system itself was designed. And last, 2 more little pieces of that, again, that balanced literacy, just lingering, daily language activities that again are quite random. So, random sentences on the board. And Brent and I have both seen this. We walked into classrooms and thought, where did this come from? What is that teacher doing? But it's just something they've been doing forever, right? Starting their day with a random sentence where they're going to fix a million different problems in the sentence, and it really lacks a focus. So a lot of these newer high quality curricular programs are very targeted in terms of what the students are focusing on at any given point to allow them to master it. It's not just a blanket, here's a sentence, paragraph, piece of writing, and we're going to fix everything all at once. And that's really challenging for kids to be able to master and do well and really understand, especially if they're struggling. So, moving away from that and thinking, connect the what to the why. Why am I doing this every day? What is my purpose and what does that serve? And then writer's workshop, same thing. Writing for me right now is like the soapbox that I'm on this year. I'm really starting to notice quite a few cracks in that and try to work through that via professional development as well. But this is a really, really challenging one for teachers to move past. The writing that comes with the Common Core Standards shift, as well as our state assessment shift, as well as in the core curriculum, is very, very different than what the teachers have done, historically for 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years in their classrooms, where they would work on one piece of writing and they'd spend, a month to 5, 6 weeks on it, and they would go through writer's workshop and conference with kids and give feedback on the whole piece of writing. And that's really not what it's about anymore. The personal narrative has kind of gone away, and all of the writing that they're doing is really connected to the text. So when we're doing opinion writing, we're not writing about what our favorite food is. We're connecting the opinion right to what the text is and really using that as our focus. So back to the beginning, keeping the text at the center. This has been really difficult for us to kind of work past because it's just so different from what the teachers are used to. And so again, we're using the high quality core curricula, but we're reverting back to a writer's workshop model where we're just fixing everything for the kids and having them go back and copy it. And that's really not the way that this was designed. And so that has been certainly a challenge for us at this point.
So I get the privilege of being able to tell you, when you do start to do this, even despite some of these sort of hangover lingering effects of balanced literacy, it makes a difference. And this is data from last year from our kindergarten, for instance. And these are the DIBELS scores. And you can see from the fall all the way to the spring that we are getting well over 80% of our kids where they need to be on these assessments. And that's really super exciting when we get to see this type of data. Here's our first grade from across the district last year. And again, you can see in the spring, these data points well up over the 80% mark. So some really exciting things to see for us. And then as a district in Pentucket, when I started in 2018, Pentucket overall in Massachusetts was in the 43rd percentile for accountability performance. And that really just seems so dramatically low for the community. So we began doing all this work, not just in literacy, we did a lot of it in math as well. But it was a combination. We use the phrase skillful implementation of high quality curriculum. It's actually the name of our teaching and learning blog as well. So we don't use the fidelity word much, because much of what Jen just spoke about was, if you're using fidelity, you're just using the script in the teacher's guide. Skillful implementation is taking into consideration all those things. So we start doing all of that work, and then this past year we are now into the 64th percentile, and we actually think we should as a district be above the 75th percentile. So we know we have more work to do, but all of that is while the pandemic was happening, and all those school interruptions. So some really exciting shifts in data for us as a district. And then this one here too, when we use our DIBELS data pre-pandemic, our students, only 68% of our kindergarten to grade 3 students were meeting the benchmarks on DIBELS. And last year it reached 80% in the springtime. So this works. And I know it works because I did this work as an elementary principal going all the way back to 2008 as well. This is in Melrose, Massachusetts. I was the principal at Lincoln Elementary, and we were a school that was really struggling. It was 50% high needs, and it was a school that was having a challenging time. And we started some of that work, and you can see initially, even upon start of it, we actually dipped. So we actually had struggles in trying to get it all together, and then it started to come together to the point where we ended up getting over 80% proficiency, but we closed this gap. So those students who were students with disabilities, we closed that gap. We more than doubled, or almost doubled more than doubled their proficiency rate, and really narrowed that gap. And then Lincoln ended up being a National Blue Ribbon School in 2015. So we just stormed through a bunch of stuff here. There are some resources here, and we are going to share the slide deck with you, I think in PDF form, so you can click on some of the links as well. All of our documents are generally available. Our teaching and learning blog is great. At least I like to think it's great, right? We're writing it. But it does take a little bit look at the different types of curriculum, and we show some examples of student work and so forth. And there's some really good tools in here. If you want to hear more of us, if you have not heard enough of us, here are some different ways. We were guests on the Melissa and Laurie podcast. I have an interview, a Hegarty case study interview in Glean, and Jen has done some work on the Mass Literacy Guide as well. So you can hear her talking a little bit about early reading too. So all sorts of different ways if you want to hear us talk about some of the stuff. We talk about different aspects of all this too. Always, right, the Twitter and all that. And that's our link to our teaching and learning blog. So that's us, and always feel free to reach out as well. But I know we have about 25 minutes or so, which we're going to do some questions. So I'm going to stop the screen share, I think, and we'll bring it back. And I think our host here, Sarah, and everyone else maybe can help us with questions or chat or whatever comes up.
Yes, and reviewing the questions, I think I'm going to hand it off to Julie, and she's going to go through and read some of those questions, and so we can answer them live for everyone.
Okay, great. So our first question is, many teachers, and I'm sure that you get this a lot, many teachers have invested a lot of their personal funds on worksheets such as daily language. What are ways you have encouraged teachers to abandon their personal, very prized possessions that they have collected in favor of evidence-based practices?
Outside so the first one is those leveled libraries, right? Like I mean, talk about money. I mean, that's a lot of money, or it's a lot of scholastic points, right? You get those, and like books are books. So just because they have a level on them doesn't make it a bad book. It's just how we use it. So we actually this summer we had a lot of our teachers go back and do a they got professional development to do this. They redid their classroom libraries as knowledge building libraries to more or less correlate to and align to either our ELA curriculum or our social studies curriculum or our science curriculum, because we want kids to immerse themselves in the volume of conceptually related text. So like that's one way, is that a lot of it doesn't necessarily need to be thrown away. It just needs to be rethought of or repurposed. And the daily language things, some of that stuff just isn't applicable. And yeah, I don't have an answer for that necessarily, but a lot of it is not necessarily stuff that needs to be tossed. It just needs to be rethought about how it is used.
Yeah, it's that replacement, I think, that I was talking about. And to be quite honest with you, I haven't heard this a whole lot from our teachers, really, because these implementing curriculum like this takes a lot of time, and there is no shortage of materials within the curriculum for them to be using. And so I think they're finding they don't even have the time in their day to be doing these daily language worksheets. Some of them may be like sneaking it in during small group instruction or something, which, we'll get to that eventually. But there is so much for them to do that can replace that we have found, and then we do encourage them, if you have something on this that you've been doing, bring that in and use it as a support, right? Like Brent said, repurpose it. But we can't just tell them, don't do any more daily language worksheets. It has to be, let's move away from the worksheets, because here's how you're going to teach it in another way with maybe another tool. But we haven't heard that a whole lot, I think, honestly, because they're doing so much already that they don't even have the time necessarily. But I can empathize with that as somebody that has spent a lot of money myself on Teachers Pay Teachers. So I get it totally.
Great. And looking at our next question, I believe that the link for your flowchart will be in your slides that you'll be sharing in the PDF form. So, and what we will do is Brent and Jen will share those with us, and we will send the link with the slides out with the recording of this as well. So everybody will have access to the recording and a link, the slides in a PDF form, and they will have links to their documents that they have shared in there for everyone. And then the next one is, I'm curious what curriculum you are using. And I think that you kind of talked about it a little bit at the beginning. If you wouldn't mind sharing that, maybe some of our attendees joined and weren't able to hear what curriculum you're using, and or the key elements that you really like about the curriculum.
Sure. So we use Fundations and Heggerty as our sort of our foundational. I will say, like, we use Heggerty, but it's also, we use it skillfully. We use Heggerty, and then immediately afterwards you have to go to Fundations. You can't do it as this 10-minute standalone. Phonemic awareness is in the service of learning to decode, right? So directly from print, from the phoneme to the grapheme, and to the point where we actually, our data last year in the middle of the winter told us our second grades in classrooms didn't need to do Heggerty anymore. They had done so well, stop doing that, the standalone phonemic awareness, and just do Fundations. And the teacher's eyes just lit up, and that's 10 minutes back in your day, right? And then we have adopted Wit and Wisdom, which is made by great minds. It's all the language strands, and it's the writing, and it's the complex text. It's all those things that you saw in like those three big shifts. That's what it is intended to do. And we looked at CKLA, EL was another one that those are very similar in their sort of setup around a knowledge building literacy curriculum. But they are, like, if you're used to a workshop or an anthology, it is a big change. And that really is what our message is, that, don't just take one of those. So that's the one they said to use. We're going to buy it. We're going to put it in place, and then not work on how you're going to implement it and change your instructional practices, because you won't like it. You won't like it. It'll be boring. It'll be hard. and it'll get blamed for being unsuccessful when in reality it's the implementation and the structures around it.
And to speak to the key elements, like any program, there are going to be pieces that we really love, pieces that we're working on. But in terms of what we were looking for when selecting Wit and Wisdom, were that it was a knowledge building curriculum based on the research, were that it provided all students, regardless of their ability to decode, access to complex grade level text, that where the writing was established with the text at the center. We had speaking and listening standards that were built in, scaffolds built in for students that are struggling. It was important that all of those pieces really were there. That spiraling of the standards, of course, built around the grade level standards and all of that. So there are a number of programs that do all of those pieces very well. And it just depends on, as you go through the process, feedback from teachers, what's going to fit with your district and your students really the best.
We had a district leader that we were speaking to the other day who said, so I don't know if I can afford it because I still need to fund all my leveled readers. And I was like, no, I don't think you're getting it.
Great. And then just a follow up to that, what do you have a curriculum that you're using for tier 2, and does your tier 2 happen on a daily basis?
So we use a tiered approach, and we have some tools, some pieces. Generally, when we think about tiered instruction, tiers are not people, they're not locations. Tiers represent the level of intensity, frequency, and format of instruction. So, and when we do tier 2 instruction, it's on a very precise component. So the tier 2 instruction is driven by the assessment of how we assess to the point of breakdown. So if we know it's a decoding issue, we want to know even more precisely, is it short vowels or is it long vowels? Where is that breakdown? And we essentially use what's being done in tier 1 and intensify it. Now, there may be some changes as you go along. It's, nothing here is cut and dry and it's exactly the way it is. There are some, variables to that. But that's how we sort of think about in an approach that we intensify what we do in tier 1, because we know what we're doing in tier 1 is evidence-based. When it's not evidence-based, then you might actually have to use something different in tier 2 and tier 3. And then they go back to the tier 1 and it's getting undermined. And that's one of those sort of lingering effects that I think you can't intervene your way out of this.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is, did you have any pushback? This is referring to your data that you shared back when I believe you were the principal of the elementary school. Did you get any pushback when you saw the dip in the beginning of your start of your implementation? And if so, how did you respond and keep them going?
Yeah, I don't even think they knew what we were doing yet, right? When the dip happened, we were still so immersed in, but there was a good, I do remember a point after like a year, we were in the second year of doing some of the work, and there definitely was some pushback. And there was, again, the school was sort of this 50% high needs. It was historically the lowest performing school in the city. We had, there were 26 different languages spoken in the homes of the 400 kids. And I do recall specifically a faculty meeting where we had a teacher who was really great, loved the kids, had been there a long, long time. And she said, don't they know, they being just like anyone and everyone, right? Don't they know who we have here? And I sort of paused and I turned over to the window and I opened the window shade and I pointed out, and across the street you could see there were apartment buildings where a lot of the immigrant families would come and live. And I said, look out that window. That's not changing. You need to. And I think that was so, and that I don't recall a lot of pushback after that. And we made the data very public. We had, now we do the data digitally. I used to color in the charts, and we put them up in the teacher's lounge of the data of where they were going from, each of the benchmark assessments. So it was really visible to them about that work, and we made it very present. And now we do it virtually, and I think generally I'm probably a little kinder about it now. Jen chuckles though, because it's a good combo, in the sense of, and sometimes she can play bad cop too. I don't always have to play bad cop.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah. I think part of the preventing or trying to anticipate some of that pushback too is that groundwork that's kind of laid at the beginning, where teachers can understand, why we're on the path that we're on. And so they're trusting the process a little bit too, and they're willing to stay on it. Now, that's not everybody, but if you can have a few key people within the school that are willing to say, we had this dip, but this is the right thing, and we are going to keep going, right? And they're bringing their team along. We saw a small dip in writing this year, based on our assessments from last spring. And, we're not just throwing out all the writing, and the teachers, they're not up in arms necessarily about, the writing and the curriculum, but it's, that tells us where we need to go next. And we know what we're doing is based on research, and we're on the right path, but we need to keep going. We need to find a way to reflect and make it better. And we will, not every teacher feels that way, but we do have, some teachers there that are helping lead the charge, and they're leading their teams, and they're doing the work to try to make it better. So that's important too, but they understand though why we made the shift. They may not love it yet, but they're there and they get it. And so they're willing to stay on that path with us at this point.
That literacy plan makes a big difference too. So that is not, it's not something that like I wrote myself or Jen wrote herself. We had a lot of stakeholders involved, and very purposeful about who we invite to that table, right? We get some people who we know are ready to push, and then you get some other people who are unsure, right? Because you kind of need a critical mass of folks to understand. So that document is really important, and it does help sort of with that, keep the focus on where you're headed. So.
Great. Okay, and then our next question is, can you speak more about the flood time and how that was set up and organized, and how did you get teachers on board with this?
Yeah, it's never the same every year. We're always tweaking the schedule. And even as an elementary principal, we were always tweaking it every year. I've yet to have the perfect schedule. So, it's tricky. So that's some of the work I did earlier on, even before Jen was here, about, like a third grade teacher doesn't get to decide when they have music and recess, and like, it's all part of the bigger picture of how it all works. And once you get it done, most people can never imagine going back to the way it was, where they all just sort of picked and chose, and basically survival of the fittest, the most veteran teacher who knows exactly who to ask when gets the perfect schedule, and everyone else can forget it. It's oftentimes it's actually driven by special education services too, because you need to stagger those. There's a few webinars out there. Sharon Dunn and myself had done one about 2 years ago on scheduling with elementary school. I think you can, it was all through Stephanie Staller, who's another PD trainer. So the three of us had facilitated one, and there's some examples of what that looks like. We don't really necessarily send our examples out because they're so contextual, and it just varies a little bit, but that schedule really is critical to helping it, and that we say, here is when you're teaching literacy at this grade level, here's when you're teaching math, here's when you're teaching science. And that is a change for folks if they are not used to being dictated to that. High school teachers are told that all the time, right? Like, they don't get a say in that. And it's what it really turns out to is, we have to manage. You have to have an administrator. You stand back. You have all these needs across your entire building. Your needs as a second grade teacher are important to you, but as the administrator, you can see the needs across the entire building, and you have to have the ability to be able to move those chess pieces around. And it's not about what you want as an individual teacher. It's about what is best for the collective school and the kids. And if you that's that dogmatic leadership. And if you can hang your hat on that, they can argue. It's just not going to get anywhere,
And sometimes they do get somewhere though. And that's the voice, but that's there are pieces, we had grade levels, we engaged the grade level leaders, in giving feedback on the schedule, and some of it is feedback we're willing to take, and others is just, chatter, but it's, these are the things that we're not negotiating on, that we're not moving, right? We can't move the intervention block because we've structured this on purpose to free up the interventionist on purpose so they can get into every grade level. But, you want to extend your morning meeting by 10 minutes and shift this around, that's feedback that we want to hear. We want you to have a voice in it and feel like you have some level of control over it for what works best for you and the students that you have in front of you. However, there are pieces of this that do, have a domino effect. You change one schedule and the whole row of dominoes gets knocked over and people don't realize that it's affecting the whole school when they want the interventionist to come in, 2 hours earlier than we had that scheduled for, that affects everybody. And so those things are not negotiable, but can you have a voice in it to try to get people on board 100%? And that really does help, giving them like a semblance of control, even if you already have an idea of kind of where it's headed, or you have those non-negotiable pieces of, you can't have your prep time in the morning. That's just not happening. Your grade level prep time is here. And that's just the way that it's going to be right now. But, I'll negotiate with your grade level on this other piece. And that so far has been pretty successful. Does everybody love their schedule? Not necessarily, but that's just the way that things are now. The schedule is made for you, and that's just how it is. And it's for the betterment of all the kids. And it's so that you can have the support that you need too. We want you to have that support during literacy time. And if we start to move this around, someone might take it from you. And so just thinking of that collective ownership of all the kids.
Great. I think that's always a struggle, is just trying to get those schedules in place on a yearly basis. And every year they change just a little bit. And it's just one of those things that I think, everybody just has to roll with. Okay, our next question is, do you have a resource with the do's and don'ts of when it comes to best practice, what to replace things with?
Yes, we do. Some of it we've made, some of it we've taken from elsewhere. I honestly can't even remember the source right now, but we do have one. And when we find it, we'll send it along with the slides and the recording of this. But Brent, do you remember who made it?
Yeah, well, there's a few out there, right? So it's a combination of a couple things. And I think this is and Jen talks about like replacements, right? And there definitely is a do this, not that. But I say that with caution, because there's always context to that, right? So a frequent thing I hear amongst those who believe they are immersing themselves in the science of reading will say, oh, okay, in first grade, I know I'm supposed to use decodables now and not leveled readers. Well, no, you don't use decodables just like you used to use leveled readers. It's an entirely different manner and method of which you're doing it. So it's really not a direct replacement, right? It's a whole different approach. So there's this caution with this do this, not that type of thing. But if you have the context, and again, you have a plan, and you get to the why. So you can say use decodable readers. That's the what. Explain how and why. What's its purpose? And always connecting it back to the purpose really helps people to begin to connect what the research is saying. Why am I doing this instead of the way I used to do it? And then they won't have those lingering impacts, right?
And the coaching is powerful there too. The being able to apply it directly. Teachers want to know, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do in the next hour? You're telling me that this isn't necessarily the right thing. Here's the not that part. This is what I'm not supposed to do. I want to know, what am I supposed to do then when I see this group tomorrow? And that's where the coaching really comes into play. Let's take a different approach to this. Let's look at this, but in a really tangible way and kind of a less global view of what I'm actually doing. And so that coaching is really important to be able to say, we're misusing this tool here. We're sitting down and giving a guided reading lesson with this decodable reader to kids that don't even need decodable readers, right? But it's hard for teachers to see that without really applying it to exactly what they have in front of them and what instruction they're actually delivering to. So that direct and targeted coaching them through and feedback as an administrator is really important.
Teachers, by and large, want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing. They are good people. and they want to help kids read. No one woke up 10 years ago in a balanced literacy class, walked in and said, I am here to keep kids from learning to read. Like, that's not what they do. We know that. But because they always want to do the right thing, there's often a lot of just tell me what I need to do. And it's not so easy all the time. I need you to understand why you need to do it, because I won't be here tomorrow, right? Like that type of thinking behind it. We get some people who are black and white thinkers, right? Like, well, you said to do this. Well, yeah, but not in this context, so it's all those types of things. So.
Great, thank you so much. And then you spoke to your what you do with your tier 2. We have a question about what the curriculum is used for your SPED or tier 3. And then another part of that question from this person is how to teach writing embedded in Wit and Wisdom.
Yeah. So I don't think we use like a totally separate curriculum. The vast majority of our students in special education or students with disabilities are in the general education setting. We do mostly inclusionary work. They may get additional pull-out work here or there, especially as they maybe get a little bit older. And we have the vast majority of our special education teachers at the elementary level have some Orton Gillingham background. So they would get some form of either Wilson or Orton Gillingham. Sometimes LIPS is another program. It might vary depending upon the needs of the kids. So those are sort of the additional curriculum tools we might use. I can say Jen and I are currently sort of immersed in trying to figure out a place for EBLI, evidence-based literacy instruction, which is actually a speech-to-print approach as opposed to print-to-speech. So that's our next thing to tackle. And so I think that's sort of like the curriculum side, but a lot of it is using the tools of tier 1 and helping the kids learn how to be more independent with it. We do have some sub-separate special education programs. We do have some language-based programs, and they use some tools. They use Wit and Wisdom too. So they teach it in the sub-separate setting. They modify it is what they do. And they use some supplemental tools as well. So they'll use Framing Your Thoughts, which is from the Project Read, and they'll use components of that. And they'll just be more structured and systematic around it. Jen can probably speak to the writing part of Wit and Wisdom, but because that is basically her love this year. She has immersed herself in that, in making sure we move that forward.
Yeah, so the writing is embedded within Wit and Wisdom. So that is a piece too. That's kind of a funny anecdotal story of, it's hard for teachers sometimes to see where that writing is within the curriculum because it does look so different. They may spend a whole lesson or 2 or 3 working on executing and examining the perfect topic sentence, right? And to teachers, that doesn't feel a whole lot like the writing that they have been doing in the past, where the students would write, whole paragraphs, again, that writer's workshop and be there. The transition to academic writing connected to a core text is a big transition, working with first graders on how to write a narrative that's connected to a text as opposed to writing a narrative story about what they did after school yesterday is really challenging. And so that's kind of what we're working through right now. And, we're towing that sort of, I'm calling it the Goldilocks line of how do we support kids that are struggling, but not so much that they're not actually doing the work and doing the writing. And so I think the answer to that is very complex, and it depends on the kids and the teachers and what year of implementation you're on. I'm really hopeful, and I think we will, continue to get a lot better with it, and we'll find a way to strike that balance, but it is all embedded. All genres of writing are embedded. They work through the key pieces of writing that they need to. They learn how to write a topic sentence. They learn how to cite evidence. They learn how to elaborate on that evidence, write sound conclusions. And it's a cohesive model through, we have it now K-8, actually, Wit and Wisdom, and they're using the same language. I mean, they start using the word evidence and elaboration, in kindergarten and first grade, and they're using it all the way through to 8th grade, which that vertical alignment is hugely important and allows more students to be successful, right? The students that struggle, especially, they need that cohesiveness. They need that vertical alignment. They can't go from grade to grade and have the teachers teaching writing completely differently, which is really what was happening in the past, right? Everyone was kind of doing it their own way. And so that's the piece that I really enjoy. And, as an administrator and a leader, you can connect those dots for teachers too. They don't necessarily always see what the students are doing after they leave them, and they don't see what they're doing in the grades before. So I'm able to connect that and say, oh yeah, well, you may not love that organizer, but they used it last year. These kids are going to be great with it, and in year 2 of implementation, we're already seeing some of that. The kids know what we mean when we say elaboration. They may still be working on it, but they know the general idea of it, right? So that's been really huge, but it's certainly a work in progress when we think about the best ways to actually facilitate writing instruction and how it connects to the tools that we have in front of us.
Great, thank you again. And we'll try and answer maybe one more question here. We've got a couple more in the box, but we'll try and answer this one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. So the question is, when 80% or more of your class is in the well below benchmark category, and they're unable to access Tier 1 material, what is your best approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to think of your whole class as like whole class intervention, more or less, right? But you have to know, so when you say 80% below benchmark, where is their point of breakdown, right? And that's where you focus your instruction. You can't rely on the reading specialists and the folks to come in and bail you out of that. There's too many kids to do it. So you yourself as a classroom teacher have to end up being more of that. And if it's your building that's at 80%, right, as the principal, you have to reshape the manner in which you teach reading. And you might have to give it more priority as far as schedule and personnel throughout it. But yeah, you might alter the manner in which you do it. We said, a good phonics program can do it in 20 to 30 minutes. But 20 to 30% of kids are going to probably need another 20 minutes of instruction on that same concept, right? And you have to build that into your schedule. That's part of it. And if your whole class, if you're at 80% of your class is like that, then you do another 20 to 30 minutes for, in small groups with kids is what you end up doing. So you just build the needs into your schedule. And, for kids who have a hard time accessing complex text because they're really not at a decoding level, you read it to them. You have them hear it auditory. You use audio. We in the upper grades, we're using Learning Ally as a tool so that kids can hear the language and they can still have the dialogue and the language about what is complex text. And Tim Shanahan says this, and Jen loves this line, right? And he's a great researcher. If you don't know him, he's fantastic. He does some great work. He says, so we can either teach kids and engage them with complex text, or the first time they can see it is on the state assessment. So kids cannot learn to read complex text without complex text. We have to give them that opportunity. And sometimes it's slow and laborious, and it's in small pieces until we move them forward. So
it's a great kind of way to leave you all, and I think summarize kind of why we're even here today, right? Is when you have 80% of a class or a grade level or a school or a district that is not meeting expectations on an assessment that is valid and reliable, it really is pointing to a shift that is needed in Tier 1 in some capacity, right? That's kind of the data that Brent uncovered to say, maybe we need to start doing things a little bit differently for all kids so that we can start to change, flip that triangle back over the other way. So, I think that's why we're all here today. That's why we're looking at new curricular materials. That's why we're talking so much about Tier 1 and global systems, because, if 80% of kids aren't accessing Tier 1, then something in Tier 1, is not meeting the needs of most of our kids. And so how can we do that a little bit better? We can shift all of these things that we spoke about for Tier 1 in the hopes to try to bring more kids able to access that, really. So
great, thank you so much. And we will go ahead and wrap it up. I know we're 1 minute over our allotted time that we were scheduled, but we are so very grateful to have Brent and Jen with us here today. And we hope that you were able to take at least one thing away, if not multiple things away, to be able to implement and work towards changing and shifting the practices and structuring your systems. And we will follow up with an email with the recording and the PDF of their slides and get that to you as soon as possible. And we thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.